I like fountain pens. These days, there is often a perception that the usage of fountain pens is dying out. That's partly true. It's also partly true that the usage of all writing instruments is dying out, relatively speaking, the way technology is advancing. But there are still people who love fountain pens. They like the feel of writing with fountain pens. They like the kind of writing you get when you use fountain pens. And this is much beyond nostalgia. I'm not only interested in fountain pens, I'm particularly interested in Indian fountain pens. So I collect fountain pens. I especially collect Indian fountain pens. I have been interested in history in general, and I was therefore interested in the history of Indian fountain pens, nibs, and fountain pen ink. I found all kinds of journalistic accounts on fountain pens in India. Typically, journalistic accounts, so and so produced the fountain pen with which the constitution was drafted. That kind of thing. I found a lot of articles on the history of Indian fountain pens in the blog that Chom Ganguly writes. Many of you will have read it, Inked Happiness. But I could not find a book which documents the history of manufacture of Indian fountain pens, inks, and nibs. It is also true that there's been somewhat of a churn in the Indian fountain pen industry. When I say fountain pen, I can't keep saying ink and nibs, I mean all of it together. We tend to think that they're dying out, the Indian fountain pens, because people buy the foreign brands, they buy German pens, they buy British pens, they buy American pens, they buy Japanese pens, they even buy Chinese pens. Where are the Indian pens? What some people do not realize is these are interesting times for Indian fountain pen manufacturers because in the last 20 years or so, there have been several new entrants. By profession, I'm an economist, and therefore, inevitably, I tend to look at things with the lens of economic policy. So there was a double objective. Is it possible to write a documentary history of the making of fountain pens in India and look at economic policies which have either encouraged or discouraged the development of that industry? As a collector of fountain pens, I got in touch with Shobhan Ray, who also is interested in fountain pens. He's a collector of fountain pens and he wrote a monograph on Dr. Radhika Nath Saha. So Shobhan and I got in touch with each other and we decided to put together this book on the history of Indian fountain pens with that economic lens. It's just been published by Rupa. It's called Inked in India, and the subtitle says The Make and Unmake of India's Fountain Pens, which is what the book is about. So it is of interest to people who are interested in fountain pens, perhaps a rare breed. It's also interesting, will be of interest to those who are interested in the history of economic policy making in India. Let's start at the beginning. And the beginning, of course, is the manufacture of ink. Everyone who's watching this video probably knows that there isn't a clear dividing line which says that this is when we started making fountain pen ink, because other kinds of ink used to be made earlier, ink for printing. Perhaps the earliest person to make fountain pen ink in India, and the making of fountain pens predated the making of fountain pens proper, because as I said, there are other forms of ink and those were readily converted into fountain pen ink. So on the basis of the research that Shobhan and I did, our identification is that the first manufacturer of fountain pen ink, so to speak, in India was P.M. Bakshi from Kolkata. What about fountain pens? Quite often you will have heard that the first fountain pen in India was made by Ratnam, K.V. Ratnam 302, depending on whether you want the indigenous version or the part foreign version, 1932 or 1935. The Ratnam 302, they were a family of goldsmiths in Rajamundry. They met Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhiji said, why don't you make something useful instead of making gold jewelry? And hence they started to make fountain pens. This is the normal line you will find. And quite often the Ratnam pen is therefore given as a gift to visiting dignitaries, or sometimes taken as a gift for dignitaries abroad, as the last president did. But as I said in passing earlier, the first person to make a fountain pen in India was Radhika Nath Shah. Around 1907, pretty soon after fountain pens started to be made anywhere in the world. You date it to what? You date it to 1880s. So pretty soon after that, remarkable, in Lucknow, Dr. Radhikanath Shah began the Lakshmi pens, which were fountain pens, and there were also stylo pens. Stylo, you could unscrew the top, and the same pen could function either as a fountain pen or as a stylo. A stylo had a tip. He was remarkable. He was not only the first, he took out patents, not only in India, in the US, in Europe. As manufacturers of fountain pens, nothing very much happened after that. There were a lot of fountain pens that were imported. And the next person we come to, even before Ratnam, was Fanindranath Guptu and Guptu's perfection. This started to be made in the mid 1920s. As education spread, wherever education spread, whether it was Hyderabad, whether it was Kolkata, whether it was Benares, whether it was some other place, wherever education spread, there was a demand for fountain pens, there was a demand for writing, and in and around that place, fountain pen manufacturing started to happen. Sometimes there were dealers who sold customers foreign fountain pens. They needed to be serviced. And because they needed to be serviced, they started repairing those foreign fountain pens and eventually became fountain pen manufacturers themselves. So by the time it was 1947, the foreign fountain pen manufacturers existed in India. You had the domestic fountain pen manufacturers also. And you had ink manufacturers also. Originally, of course, the ink used to be in the form of tablets. which needed to be dissolved in water to make them ink. One of the earliest was Krishnaveni. There was also today, some people, particularly people who are older, may remember Camlin as a maker of ink, as a maker of fountain pens. Camlin actually stands for camel ink. Originally, the tablets that were made used to have the brand name horse. And then the producers decided that instead of calling it horse, why not call it camel? Because camel conveys the impression of being able to travel a long distance without water. So those tablets from horse, they became camel. And when it started making ink proper, that camel and ink combined to make camel. Sometimes, as a figure of speech, people will say Gama Palwan. He was a world famous wrestler, world champion, in fact. Of course, he hails from what is today Pakistan. It was all the unified country then. When Gem and Company started to make fountain pens, they were looking for a brand name. And some of these were large pens. So therefore, their brand name was called Gama. Particularly in the 1930s, there were a lot of manufacturers, centers particularly in Rajamundry, but all over the place. Many of these were, of course, small scale. So as I said, when we come to the time of independence, there were the foreign manufacturers, there were the domestic manufacturers also, of fountain pens, of ink, and nibs. Many of them were of course small scale, by which I simply mean small in size. I don't mean small scale in the sense of the small scale sector reservations. I will come to that in a minute. When independence happened, it would have been normal to expect that all of these would coexist. And therefore, depending on the customer's wishes, I would buy a foreign pen or a domestic one. The first blow that happened, so to speak, was the Board of Trade did a report, which we have quoted in the book, which recommended that one should clamp down on imports of ink. And it recommended that over a period of time, it recommended that there should be a 37% import duty on import of ink on grounds of self-sufficiency. People who know about economic policy know about the policy of import substitution, which encouraged inefficiency and domestic production which was unable to compete. Exactly similarly, over a period of time, there was a clamping down on imports. Leading through to the 1950s, ink, pens, all of these became very difficult to import. So there's virtually no protection from imports. However, oddly enough, if you look at the first trade agreement we had with China, both countries were very similar in terms of development trajectories. Both were trying to diversify from agriculture into manufactured production. And at that time, by the way, China had only one fountain pen manufacturer to speak of, the Wolf Manufacturing Company, which was subsequently nationalized and which we know today as Hero, or used to know as Hero. We still know it as Hero. In that first trade agreement, we signed an agreement saying that we would import fountain pens from China. So we completely closed imports and competition from imports except from China. We next come to the 1960s, where in the 1960s, in the list of products, in the list of 47 products that were reserved for protection, They were reserved for production by the small scale sector reservations, which simply meant that no new entrants could enter into the production of that particular item. In that list of 47 items, you will find fountain pens. So we closed all production and all new entry on the part of large firms. Small scale sector reservations did not mean that existing large scale producers would have to close down, but there would be no new entrants from the large scale sector. Soon after that, there was the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act and the tightening up of the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, as a result of which you will know about IBM exiting, you will know about Coca-Cola exiting. You may not know that Pilot India used to exist, and Pilot India at that time used to employ almost 150 workers. Pilot, a subsidiary of the Pilot company, also exited. After this, there were labor problems. And there were the Sanghvi brothers. I said Pilot employed about 150 workers, which was large for its time. The Sanghvi brothers, Dheeraj, employed about 250 workers. So all these closed down. The consequent result was no protection from abroad, no competition from abroad, little competition from within the country, and these fountain pens that we started off by talking about, these were what are called eyedroppers, where you filled ink directly into the barrel. Technology evolved, technology changed. These days, anyone who uses a fountain pen will use either a cartridge or a converter. Eyedropper pens are used only as a rarity. Because of this protection, there was inefficiency. As a result of which, people tended to say that Indian fountain pens are more of fountains and less of pens. But inevitably, the competition would come. The competition came with the liberalization. The competition came with the removal on restrictions on imports. The competition came in the form of FDI. Because most Indian fountain pen manufacturers are MSME, used to profits from a protected market, they did not upgrade technology. They did not invest, so they could not survive. Therefore, many of them closed shop. They moved on to other products, or if they remained in writing instruments, they moved away from making fountain pens to making rollerball pens, gel pens. In the last 20 years, as I said, there's been some new entry also. Given that new entry, I tend to think that we will never have hundreds of fountain pen manufacturers. Why should we need hundreds of fountain pen manufacturers in the small scale sector? But we will hopefully soon have about 10 fountain pen manufacturers who are able to compete and able to sell in the global market. And by the way, in passing, I do not know whether you know, at least people who use fountain pens will probably know, that recently William Penn, which is actually an Indian company, has bought over Sheffers, as it has bought over Lapis Bird earlier. I will deliberately not mention names, but I can think of 4 or 5 Indian fountain pen manufacturers today who are capable of taking on competition from anywhere in the globe. I know that Chinese pricing is not very transparent, but even then I think they're capable of taking on something like Jinhao, provided they generate economies of scale, provided they invest in technology, provided they invest in marketing and distribution. I've been talking about fountain pens, but let me quickly mention India makes some of the best fountain pen ink in the world. Unless you are talking about fountain pen manufacturers who use proprietary nibs, like let's say Sailor, India makes some of the best nibs in the world outside of Germany and China, of course, where quality can often be somewhat uneven and erratic. India makes some of the best nibs in the world. When you buy a foreign pen, you will sometimes not realize that the nib there might have actually originated from Tanwright in Kanpur or from Ambitious in Delhi. This is roughly what the book does. I've stated it to you very briefly, but roughly this is what the book does. It also has pictures, color pictures in color, some from my collection, some from Soban Ray's collection, some from Chaum Ganguly's collection. I think every reader will find this book interesting because, as I said, it is about the history of economic policy making, it's about the history of fountain pens, and it is about how wrong economic policies brought about the demise of the industry and how, since those policies have now been rectified, how we as authors hope that the Indian fountain pen industry